Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Rich Martin, Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Itential. And today we're going to talk about and look at a demonstration on how to achieve self-service network automation with Itential and ServiceNow. So just a few points in the demonstration and the discussion we'll have today. Hopefully you'll come out of this having a better understanding of how to publish automations in Itential and how to define the different execution methods. And specifically here today, we're going to look at how to publish a network automation that's executed using an API endpoint and post method. We'll also take a look at how to build a transformation to parse the data that's passed into the API method from ServiceNow. And we'll also take a look, amongst other things, at how to create a self-service catalog entry inside ServiceNow. So we're going to spend a little time. This is a little different from most demos. A lot of times we spend a lot of time inside the Itential demo automation platform as part of the demo. This time around, we're going to spend some time in the ServiceNow platform showing how to kind of, as an administrator, at least one methodology to configure ServiceNow specifically for self-service catalog entries that can run an automation within the Itential platform. And so just as a visual of what we'll be doing today, we're going to be really showing two things. If you've paid attention to any of the other ServiceNow and Itential demonstrations and webinars in this series, you'll notice that we've kind of built upon kind of a simple method of integrating with ServiceNow that's typically from the Itential platform into ServiceNow through a REST API. So it's kind of, at least in this diagram, bottom to top. But in this demonstration, we will still be doing the bottom to top. So from our automation and integrating into ServiceNow by doing things like opening a change request ticket, updating that ticket, and closing that ticket. But also where we're starting from, the origin point that we're starting from here is now within the ServiceNow platform, and creating a catalog entry so that it's now a top-down situation where you're going to, an end user would click on a catalog entry that has something to do with networking or network automation as a service. That's going to call the network automation workflow within the Itential platform. So it's the top down. And then as the network automation runs in our platform, we now communicate kind of from the bottom back up in covering that whole process of integrating with ServiceNow. So you get to see both sides of it, including us building from the top down from ServiceNow into and making it work inside to call automations inside of our platform. So with that, let me transition over to the demonstration itself. So let me share my screen, one moment. Okay, fantastic. So the first thing we want to take a look at is, let's look at that workflow. Now, this is a simplified workflow because the focus here and the intention here is to really show how we can create the integration from ServiceNow back into Itential, right? So that's the unique part of this third webinar in the series. And so we've done some more complex workflows in the past, even the last two of them, and we've built them from scratch. So I wanted to simplify this just to show the basic interaction between a workflow within our platform calling back out to ServiceNow as kind of a contrast to ServiceNow calling back into us. And so the first thing that we're going to do here is, this workflow is not going to be started from inside the Itential platform. It's going to be executed. The origin point of execution is going to be from ServiceNow. So this very first task in our workflow, I've called it get variables from ServiceNow. And that's a transformation. And if you've watched our previous webinars, we talked about a transformation, and I'm going to show you what a transformation is in this specific case. But a transformation is how we receive data from an API call and manipulate that data so that it can be used in subsequent API calls in a workflow. So in this case, the very first thing we do, the very first step, is with the knowledge of understanding that this is going to be called from an API call into the Itential platform. We want to be able to have ServiceNow pass some variables back into us that originate from the service request ticket that gets started from the self-service portal and catalog in ServiceNow. So we want to get those variables into the platform, into our workflow, and that's what this transformation does. And so if we look at what that transformation looks like, On the left-hand side, we have an incoming schema. So this is a JSON schema. We've talked about this before, but it helps to define, or it doesn't help, it actually defines the data that we should be expecting to get from the API call. And in this case, we've created an object. We're saying, hey, we should expect an object, a JSON object that is actually literally called form data. And then these are the variables inside of it and their types, strings here, of the data that's going to be passed from ServiceNow, that request, into our platform, so that we can use that information and utilize it from other areas in the workflow, some other tasks. So the key point here is that this is specifically explicitly defined as the format that we are expecting ServiceNow to pass data to us. So when we go into the ServiceNow platform, we have to ensure that all of those requirements are met, that this particular JSON schema matches the object that we pass into it through that API call, and we'll be building that out. And so then on the left-hand side, so again, when we do a transformation, this is a modular, reusable, and graphical way of taking the data that we receive from an API call and then making it available in all kinds of different ways. We can do all kinds of manipulations here. But in this case, I wanted to start with a very simple way of breaking that data out into individual components. You can do that. There are other things. We can create new JSON objects. We can create strings, and that's all of these methods on the right. So there's all kinds of things you can do as a transformation. But in its simplest sense, we're taking data in from an API call under a schema, so it has to fit this definition, and then we can take that data and easily manipulate it and put it in a format that's relevant for subsequent API calls and tasks in a workflow. So that's the very first thing. We want to get that data from ServiceNow. The next thing now is we're going to open a brand new change request ticket. So when we create a catalog request in ServiceNow, this is a requested item, right? So this is different from a change request ticket in ServiceNow. So a requested item is a customer or an end user saying, I want to order this service, right? And so that opens a certain kind of ticket in a different table in ServiceNow. And normally what happens is, in order to fulfill that request, some other ticket needs to be open, or for an organization or a group like the networking team, or if it's a complex network or a complex service, it could be multiple tickets for multiple teams to be open, so that everybody can do their part to for perhaps for infrastructure, in order to provide this service to whoever's ordering it. So the first thing we want to do here is open a new change request ticket that is specific for this request. When we open that ticket, we're now calling back out through Itential into ServiceNow. So this is that down, the bottom up integration from Itential into ServiceNow from our diagram earlier. And when we make that request, it's going to return some information, and that's our third box here: get change request details. We're going to receive that information from ServiceNow. Some of those details include things like, what is the ServiceNow ticket ID? What is the ServiceNow ticket number? There's a ton of information that we covered in our last episode of the series, so you can take a look at that. But that's a transformation now that not only receives that data, but manipulates it so it can be used a little bit later for our update to the same ticket. Then we actually have a child job that runs another task, another workflow, to actually do the network changes. And we're not necessarily focused on the network changes. We've shown that quite a bit, but really we need to understand that the network changes is still part of the overall workflow. I mean, that's why we have a network automation, but we also need to include the process in order to help reduce the amount of time it takes to fulfill a request like this, to reduce the swivel chairing, copying, pasting, things like that, especially in regards to ServiceNow. So we do the network change itself, and then we need to update the ticket in our next step here. That change request ticket with the additional information. In this case, hey, everything came back completed, was successful. So we want to update the ticket with that information. And then eventually we want to close that change request ticket. And that completes the change request process of the ticket from ticket open to ticket closed for the network, the network practitioner team that would handle this request. Now recall, this thing was all initiated through a request item. So a request for a new service. And so what we want to do now is our final step here, and this is one of the unique things that we're doing in this versus the previous ones, is now we're going to do some updates and handling of that original request item ticket. And so that original request item ticket, we're going to do a transformation that extracts some information. Specifically, we need to get the request item ticket ID number so that we can do an update to it. And we're going to update it with some information and then close it. That will signal back to the original requester of the new service that, hey, we're done. Everything's been completed. And here's a little documentation to show you what was going on. So with that, let's take a look really quick at how we take this automation and we publish it in our platform. So normally you could run an automation from here. We actually have a self-service catalog within the Itential platform, but since ServiceNow is we get a lot of requests for this. Hey, everything in our IT organization revolves around ServiceNow, including the catalog capabilities. So instead of running it within your platform, how do we run your automations from ServiceNow? And so once you have an automation built like this in our platform, going into an area called Operations Managers, where you can actually publish it so it can be accessible from ServiceNow and run it in our platform. So that's where we'll start off first. So the first thing we want to do is go into Operations Manager, and we want to create a new automation here. And in this case, I'm just going to call it service. Actually, I'm going to call it Itential. I'm going to give it a long name. So let me copy and paste because we want to be clear. Itential new network service, new network interface as a ServiceNow demo. So I'm going to create that. And that's going to allow us to now select that workflow. So the workflow we just took a look at is called ServiceNow Webinar 3 Demo Workflow. So I can select that here. Okay, so now I've attached this entry to that workflow. So this is the workflow that's going to be run. But now we have to define how it's going to be run. And that's part of the triggers. And so what we want to do here is we want to create a trigger. And in this case, we have several methods, but the method we want to use is attaching it or identifying it with an API call into the platform. So we give it a name, and this is where I'll call it ServiceNow. So since ServiceNow is going to be connecting into this, running this. And now we can select our trigger type. We've talked about the trigger types in our last one. In this case, we're going to do an API call. You can schedule an automation to run within the platform, at a scheduled time. You can define the schedule, hourly, weekly, daily, monthly, whatever you want to define. There's manual methods. So again, that's more like the self-service within our platform. And then an event. So if there's an event platform, a message bus, or some sort of event-driven platform, it can be triggered by an event that we can connect to. So in this case, we're going to use API. And now we're given a couple of other options here. So in this case, we have a route. So a route is an extension to the URL that is created that's unique to this particular instance of this trigger for this workflow. So this is important because it needs to match what we're going to do in ServiceNow. So I'm going to call this as ServiceNow demo. And then I'm going to take a look at here. This post body schema we need to update. So when an API call is made into our platform through this through Operations Manager, this post body schema is kind of a filtering mechanism to ensure that the data coming in from the API call actually matches what we expect. So it's essentially a first step to ensure that we're validating the input from whatever the source is running this, in this case, ServiceNow. And if it doesn't match the schema that we define here, the API call doesn't run and actually execute the workflow. So what we must do is we want to make sure that we define in the property section here a format that's acceptable, that will pass the schema, that it matches what ServiceNow is passing. And also, incidentally, that transformation as that first step that we looked at in Automation Studio, it matches that because all of that has to match. And in this case, I'm kind of simplifying things for testing purposes. I am saying basically we should expect when this API call is executed from the remote side, we should expect that a JSON object with the key value of form data should be passed to us. And that's kind of a wild card. It allows us to, at least for testing, to say, hey, just as long as that form data key is being passed correctly, then we'll accept whatever else is inside of it because it's just a generic object. We could put every one of those strings in there, and ideally that's what you do as you refine this and start testing it and working it. But this is a great way to get started, at least taking one troubleshooting variable off the table until you get it done. I also, as a networking person, I kind of look at this as almost like an ACL in the networking world, where maybe you start off with a general ACL, and then as you tighten things down, like if it's a security ACL for a device, then you tighten things down to the point where it's like very specific to like certain jump hosts or certain VPN subnets, things like that. All right, so that should get us going here. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to save here. And so that's it. So that's all we have to do in our platform to make that available at that endpoint. So we'll revisit this in a moment. So now we get to do all the fun stuff in ServiceNow. So we've been in the automation studio on the Itential side. Now ServiceNow has its own studio where you get to build things. Not quite as fun, but still, you get to build things here. So how do we get started creating a new catalog entry? So first of all, we have an existing set of catalog entries that we have in our demo platform here at Itential. And so we really need to add something to this list. So where I can go here is I can go to catalogs. We have an existing catalog called Automation Catalog. And here's all of the entries as selections. So if somebody wants to come in and order something at a network service, this is a selection. So we need to add ours to this. And so I can simply go new here and then fill out these fields. So in this case, I'm going to make sure we have consistent naming because that's part of making sure everything is nice and organized. So I'm going to give it this name, Itential New Network Interface for ServiceNow. The category matches these categories that are already defined. So in this case, it's network services. So I can do network services here. The rest of it I don't have to fill out, but having a short and a long description is pretty nice to have, especially if somebody's going to order a service. So let's go ahead and fill that out. In this case, it's a new network interface as the short description. And as the longer description, this is basically the ability to have an end user select, a router, and then along with that router, what is the interface? What is the IP address? What is the net mask? What is the port description? Again, this is just as an example, but if you're a network practitioner, this is a pretty common thing that you have to do. Not necessarily you would put a catalog entry for it, but you could. But whatever the network use case is, it could be anything. But that's what we'll try here. And so with that, I'll click submit. Now, this creates a catalog entry, and that's great, but actually we want to create a form around it, and that form also defines our variables in ServiceNow. So within the same area here, if I go down, it's created this new set of controls here, and I can now create both my variables and my form to offer for when a person selects this as an item they're trying to request. So if I go new here, now, what are the things that we have to define? Well, the first thing I said is we need to have a router. So what is the router that we want to provide? So a single line of text we'll get to in a minute, but let's do a drop box. So that's a select box here. We want to create an order. This is the order that they'll appear, that the elements in the form will appear. And so it's a ascending order. So the lower one will come first. And then here's the question: what do we want to ask the user when they're confronted with this Dropbox? Choose the router, and then it's going to try to create a name here. And this name is the name of the variable. And this is one of the things you have to make sure you keep track of, because just like in anything else, the variable names have to match up. And so what we're going to do here is just call it router, and then click submit. And since this is a Dropbox, we have to configure some choices to appear in the Dropbox. So now we have another set of controls down here for the choices. And so this is where I'm just going to define the actual devices that are in our lab, or a couple of them, not all of them. So we have one router that's for ATL0, and then I can define another one here. It's already got that order defined for ATL, and this becomes the Dropbox entries. Okay. All right, so I'm going to close these out to make it nice and clean. We can do an update on this, and we can see in a moment. Okay, core ATL 0 and 1. So those become our Dropbox items, or select box items. Okay, so that's one variable. One down, 4 to go. Next, if we have a router, let's get an interface. So we're going to use single line text. This is a free form text. We want to make sure our order is 20, so it's going to be next in the list. And I'm just going to say interface name. I'm going to try to pre-populate a variable name for me, and I'm just going to call this int face. I'm getting an example text here, and I always like this to help guide a user to enter the right information, or at least somewhat semi-correct information here. Even to remind myself, I'm going to use an example text here. Okay. All right. Next, set saves. If we have an interface, interface needs an IP address. So let's see, IP address is going to be 30 in order. And we can just do this IP address. And we'll keep that thing there. Example uh, 10.10.1. Example. Okay. Let's do another one. This is number 4. And so if we have an IP address, we have a net mask. So this is order 40, net mask. Keep it the same. And as an example, the /32 net mask for a loopback as an example. All right. And finally, our last one, it's just a port description. So this is going to be 50. Description. Give this as a variable suggestion, and we go. Okay, so now we have a proper catalog entry. And I'm just going to update this so you can see that the variables populate here. We have a proper catalog entry that has a form that we've also a form for the user to fill out that also has a series of variables for each element in the form. And those are important because as we talk about in the next step, those all have to be matching name-wise in order for them for this all to work. So if we go into ServiceNow, the catalog right now, we have this automation catalog, and you can see that I have the Itential new network interface ServiceNow. This is what we just created. And if I click on it, you'll see here's everything that we just defined, right? Here's our Dropbox with the 2 routers, and here's our example text there. If we run this, it will actually create a request item order, but it won't actually do any kind of automation back into our platform because that's our next step. So instead of doing this now, I just wanted to show that to you. Instead of doing that now, let's go back into our ServiceNow Studio because we've just completed kind of the first big step. So the next step is, the question is, how do we get a new item when it's requested through this new catalog entry to execute some sort of method or some sort of script to connect back into Itential to run the workflow that we just published through Operations Manager in Itential. So the next part of that is in ServiceNow defining something called a business rule. And so you can see we have a number of business rules already defined for our different network services. So we're going to have to create a new business rule for this. So if I click on the create application file, and if I select business rule here, it's going to take us to a new form. And here we get to fill out, some more good stuff. So I'm going to try to be consistent with my naming because it is important, especially as we get into these next 2 steps. I'm going to call this Itential new network interface or ServiceNow. And now I have to select the table within ServiceNow that this is business rule 4. And since this is a self-service catalog entry, that aligns to requested items. So in requested items is the table that we're going to use. And I'm going to click on advanced, and that's going to open up a new tab here. And that's important because that's where we fill out our script element to actually run to execute the API. All right, so now we have to determine, this is a business rule, so think of it kind of as a trigger. When this runs, we have to define the conditions for when this runs. So the first thing is, if we're creating a new ticket, insert and potentially even update need to be part of the conditions here. So when a new ticket is created and it's inserted into a database, that should be a condition that triggers at least multiple conditions here that all have to be met. So that's some of the first things we have to do is determine that. Now, if we go down to our filter conditions, we want to go to choose field, and the way that our ServiceNow instance is set up is that overall everything is identified as an Itential job. and I want to select is empty here. So this would identify kind of a new job that's been created for this ticket. We want to add another filter condition. And in this case, we're going to define that the item that's created is part of this new service we just defined, potential new network service now. So that matches our catalog entry. It's part of that catalog entry. And then we want to do one more filter condition. And this is probably the key one is state. And we've done some not only manipulation of state, but even checking in of state to determine what state a ticket is in our last webinar, ServiceNow webinar, where we were able to query the state of a ticket that was opened within a workflow. We can also set the state, right? So when we close a ticket, we're setting state to a specific value in ServiceNow. So in this case, when a requested item is created, we want to trigger this script to run our API based off of a particular state. And that state is when it transitions to work in progress. That should trigger that. So that gives us our 3 plus these 2 conditions here. I'll submit. Okay, so that finishes out at least this. Now we need to go to the advanced section because we've defined the conditions that trigger the script. Now we need to actually define the script itself. And so that's where in the advanced tab, that's where we do that. Now I'm going to copy and paste kind of a long script, but it's a very generalized script and probably based off of some best practices for ServiceNow for this. There's nothing unique to our platform, but it's specific to how having to call an API method in our platform. So I'm going to paste the script in and I'm going to walk through it because it's not complicated in the sense that, I mean, there's a lot going on, but it's not complicated and unique in the sense of this is probably very similar to calling API, REST API in all kinds of different other applications. So the key here is we can do a lot of things here like define URL. This is JavaScript that we're looking at now. But the key thing that I do want to point out, I'm going to point out the key pieces here, is this particular line here in the code has to match. So I'm leveraging a REST message, and I'll point you over here because this is our next step. Within ServiceNow, there's an area or table called REST messages that we have to define, and the name of this REST message that we're calling from our script here has to match the name here. That's why having consistent naming is important. And then we're also defining that REST message is using a post method versus like a get or anything else. So this is critical because we have to have this defined in ServiceNow. So while this executes the actual API call into Itential, it still leverages the definitions that we used in the ServiceNow REST messages, which is our next step. So beyond that, one thing to notice is that when this script is triggered, it has access to all kinds of variables. So things like current.sysid, current.number. I mean, all this is in the ServiceNow documentation, but these are the things we typically utilize within automations that we're using or our customers are using from ServiceNow to Itential. And these define things like what is the human readable service ID or ID for this particular ticket, and what is kind of the internal, like very complex ID for this ticket. In addition to that, and this is the other thing that's important, is recall those 5 variables that we set up in our form just a moment ago. That's where these exist here under current.variables.ip_address, netmask, router, intface, and description. So those names have to match the things that we've defined in that last step where we created the catalog entry and the form and define the names of the variables. And they become accessible here. And now we're formatting them into a string. And ultimately, this string is going to be used to send all of that data formatted as a JSON object back to the Itential platform. And so that's pretty much it. And then it actually goes and executes the command. So I'm going to update this. Our script is all there. And that takes us into kind of the last step for this. And so now we need to create that REST message because remember, this is the bridge that said that calls this particular REST message has to exist here for that particular post method. So now we get to create that. So if I go to create application, should be able to get the REST message here. Go to create. All right, so now we have a name. So this is probably the most critical name. It has to match what was in our script. So Itential New Network Interface Service Now, and the endpoint. So what is the endpoint? The endpoint is the URL that is going to be called in order to run this. And so we're defining that. So this is the Itential platform's URL plus this route. So remember Snow demo, SNow demo. That's what I defined back here under the trigger for this when I defined the API. So I'm back in the Itential platform when we publish this through Operations Manager. Remember, I defined the route as SNow demo, specifically, literally with that string capitalization important. Um, that's why this has to be now defined with the with the URL that's given to us by the system, but also with that route now extended to it. And then we're going to pass our authentication token as well, which is defined in the script. So with that endpoint, that gives us the correct URL for the message. But what about the data? So let me do a couple more things here. And as part of since we're communicating to our platform through JSON as JSON objects, we want to make sure we define that within here in the HTTP header. So a couple of items here that we'll put in. Okay, I'm going to submit that. And now it's created a default. So here are our HTTP methods, right? And it's created a default get. We don't need that because we're going to use post. So I'm just going to delete it, clean it up a bit. And now we get to create a new method. And this is the post method. So again, I go back to our operations manager. When we publish this, the action required is post. So let me flip back to the ServiceNow Studio. So we give it a name, HTTP method post. We don't have to define an endpoint because it inherits from the one we've already defined in the step previously. And then we can go to the request here. Now, under HTTP query parameters, this is probably the key point for this as well. Not only post and getting the URL right, but now in this content, we need to paste in the format of the data that we're going to be passing into the API call into the Itential platform. So recall our variables that we defined in the business rule. I'll go back to there. Remember, we defined these variables. So we got this set of variables from the form. We're passing into a new set of variables that have unique names. These variables now have to match this post format over here. So it's going to be inserted. It's a template, right? So it's going to be inserted. So these are the matching names for the variables we defined in that JavaScript for the business rule. So all of that has to match up, and then that creates the JSON object that we're going to pass into Itential. And of course, this form data, if you remember the name form data, is specifically, if I go back to Operations Manager, part of the post body schema. Remember the filtering. We're defining what we expect to get from the API caller is an object, is a JSON object with a key called form data, right? It also matches in our JST, our transformation, form data with all of these elements that are getting passed to it. So all of that has to match up in order for the API call to work, and then of course, in order for that data to be used in the automation when it runs. So it's critical to understand and make sure you get that right. Okay, so we update that and we should now be very good to go. Those should be all the steps necessary, at least in this general way, to set up ServiceNow so that you can not only have a catalog entry, but then it executes an automation back in Itential. So now let's go back to our catalogs here in ServiceNow. And so our catalog's defined. Here's our network services. This is our new entry. So now I get to pick, which service I want through the ServiceNow forms. Here's our example, so that's really nice. I can remember what to put in. All right, so we filled that out. And now as an end user, my job is to fill it out, click order, and then wait. So somebody at the other end of this is obviously going to pick this request item, and this is a request item ticket up. So recall, so the state is open. So remember, state was one of those trigger conditions. So we've hit the trigger condition. This exists as an potential job. This is part of that catalog entry we created called the item called the Itential New Network Interface for ServiceNow. The state is open. So that last piece, that last condition that we defined in those three conditions was the state has to progress towards work in progress. And that's what triggers the automation, the script to run that calls the automation back into the Itential platform. So if I progress this to work in progress from open, and you'll see in our activities, we only have the initial open from us, the system administrator. That's the initial order of this item. If I save this, now I'm going to go back into the automation platform and take a look at our active jobs. Now we've just seen this pop up, and it tells us here it came from an endpoint trigger. So that's the trigger we defined. We'll visualize it here. That's the trigger we defined in Operations Manager. And if I zoom into the operational view, you'll see it's actually working on the network change right now. But what first happened? Remember all those variables we defined, the form we defined in ServiceNow, that all got passed back into our workflow, right? So all of that data was populated from all those variables, including the variables we added into the form in ServiceNow as a catalog entry, passed back in to the Itential platform, where it was turned into variables through that transformation to be used within the workflow itself. The first step that we did was we opened a new change request ticket, right? So we had a request item ticket, which generates now a change request ticket, which is unique to the networking team. So we automatically did that in the workflow before we did any work, so we can document it. And that data that came out, the change number, summary, things like this is the output of that from ServiceNow. So now we're doing a bi-directional call. The initial request came from ServiceNow. It's running an automation in Itential, and now the Itential automation is now calling back into ServiceNow and opening a new ticket for its own process for the network team. We've gotten that ticket. We've opened it. The network work was completed, and now we did the update to the ticket. The ticket was closed. And recall the last two steps here was to update and close the request item. So again, we have two kind of separate things going on here. We have the request item ticket and the change request ticket. The change request ticket, you can think of this as a network task that the network team has to open and close and manage that ticket. We all did that in the automation. And now we can actually go back to the request ticket in our same automation and close that out because it closed complete. So if I go back into ServiceNow and we take a look at the request ticket, the first thing you'll notice is the status has already gone to state work in progress. That's that's the state condition that triggered ServiceNow to run that script to contact the Itential platform through API. And now the script itself has completed its work and gone close complete. Now, if we look at the documentation here for the request item, we can see the path that it took. So me as the system administrator, I opened the request item. Then me as the admin progress the item to the work in progress. That's what triggered the ServiceNow script to run, which reached out to Itential and ran the automation. The automation completed and closed it, and it gave us an update to the documentation that here's the data that was configured for that interface. It does match what was given because it was passed directly from it back to Itential. And here's the change ticket that was opened as part of the network process that goes start to finish that the automation use. So if I go to our change request and I can query this ticket, and I can take a look right here. Here's the ticket that was open and eventually closed. State was closed because it's handled all by our automation. It can update things like implementation plan, backout plan, tests, things like that. If we take a look at the notes, we could follow the trail here. This ticket was originally opened not by sysadministrator, but by our Itential account, which is tied to the automation. That's what the automation uses on the ServiceNow platform. It went from new to review state. So we pushed the state forward. We actually ended up creating documentation here. And in the documentation, you can see the item ticket number, the request item ticket number. So that's 10279, which matches 10279 here. So now we have documentation on both sides updated. So from the request side, we have the change request ticket number embedded into the activities. And from the change request side, we have the original request item ticket number embedded into the documentation of the activities. So we have that now. And then the final step was to close out the ticket, all from the automation. And so that hopefully we've been able to illustrate precisely how ServiceNow and Itential can integrate together in two different methods, right? Because the self-service method, we get this question all the time: how do you integrate with ServiceNow? And typically, we've covered from the beginning integration like this: how from a workflow we can call into ServiceNow to do things like open and manage and manipulate tickets, so that as network teams and network engineers start building out network automation workflows in our platform, now they can start bringing in things like integration into ServiceNow to help manage those tickets, to help update documentation at every process, every step of the way, instead of having them do it, manually, and which takes a lot of time, and it's a whole other process of managing tickets. So if you can start integrating that into your automation, that's going to save a tremendous amount of time for really busy network engineers. On top of that, the other way to look at it is, how do you run an automation from your platform from ServiceNow? So the origin point is from ServiceNow back into our platform. And that was the focus of today. We showed both, but really the focus of today is, how do you publish an automation, an operations manager, right? Define everything that needs to be defined. And there's not a whole lot that you have to define. We make it really easy for you to be able to go from creating an automation, testing it, running it, to publishing it, right? How to define the right schema and filtering properties here to ensure that anything that's calling in is giving us the right data to operate on, right? The correct format of data to validate that. And then going from there and defining in ServiceNow how to actually do the steps within ServiceNow, just to do the callback into the Itential platform. So with that, that ends the demo. We thank you so much for your time. Again, my name is Rich Martin, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.